There are secrets people bury so deep, they convince themselves those secrets never existed. Eliza buried hers under the wooden floorboards of her childhood home on Rosewood Lane. For 4 years, she walked over that spot every single day. 4 years of footsteps pressing down on her mother's grave. 4 years of lying to everyone who asked where her mother had gone. But secrets don't stay buried, not when the house itself starts to remember. Before we begin this disturbing true story, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's shocking tale. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Trust me, you'll want company after hearing what happened to Eliza. The question hung in the air at every family gathering, unspoken but heavy as stone. Where has your mother gone? Eliza had her answer rehearsed, polished smooth from 4 years of repetition. Her mother had taken a job overseas, she would say with a careful smile. A long-term assignment in Southeast Asia, somewhere remote where phone calls were difficult and visits impossible. The family nodded, some believing, some pretending to believe, all of them sensing something wrong beneath the surface of her words. But Eliza kept smiling, kept lying, because the truth was buried 6 feet below the living room floor of the house on Rosewood Lane. It had happened fast, the way terrible things often do. An argument that escalated beyond control. Hands that moved without thinking. And then, silence. The kind of silence that drowns out everything else. Eliza was 21 years old when she became a murderer. Mike, her boyfriend of 2 years, helped her lift the floorboards in the old house. They worked through the night, the wood creaking with every movement, dirt collecting under their fingernails as they dug. Her mother's body went into the ground, wrapped in sheets that had once been white. Then the floorboards went back down, nailed tight, and a heavy rug covered the spot. It looked exactly as it had before. Except now, Eliza knew what lay beneath. She would always know. Her father left 3 months later. He packed his belongings into cardboard boxes and drove away without looking back. He never asked about his wife directly, but Eliza saw the question in his eyes every time he looked at her during those final weeks. The not knowing ate at him until he couldn't stay in that house anymore, couldn't look at his daughter without wondering. Just her and Mike, and the secret that lived in the floorboards. The relatives started asking more questions after her father left. Why had he gone? Why didn't her mother call anymore? Why wouldn't Eliza give them her mother's phone number or address? Eliza deflected with stories about her mother's demanding schedule, about time zone differences, about poor internet connections in rural areas. Each lie built on the last until she had constructed an entire false life for a woman who was decomposing beneath her feet. The house began to feel different after the first year. Eliza told herself it was guilt playing tricks on her mind, but some nights she swore she heard sounds, creaking that didn't match her footsteps, whispers that seemed to rise from between the floorboards. The temperature in the living room stayed cold, no matter how high she turned the heat. Mike felt it too, though they rarely spoke about it. He started spending less time at the house, making excuses about work and family obligations. But Eliza saw the fear in his eyes when he did visit, the way he avoided walking across that particular spot in the living room, the way his gaze would drift to the rug and then quickly away. Sleep became a battleground. Eliza's dreams filled with images of her mother's face, pale and accusing. She would wake gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the house silent around her except for the settling sounds that every old house makes. Except these. Sounds felt deliberate, like the house was shifting, adjusting to the weight of what it held. During the day, Eliza moved through her routines on autopilot. She went to work at the local library, she smiled at customers, she organized books with hands that had once held a life, and then let it go. Coworkers thought she seemed distant, distracted, but no one asked why. People rarely ask the questions they're afraid to hear answered. Mike called less frequently as the second year passed. When they did speak, their conversations felt hollow, 2 people trying to pretend they weren't bound together by blood and dirt and silence. He suggested once that maybe they should leave, sell the house, start over somewhere new, but Eliza couldn't. Leaving felt like abandonment, like running away would somehow make it all real in a way that staying didn't. So she stayed, and Mike grew more distant, and the house grew colder. The 3rd year brought Aunt Claire. She appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in November, her car pulling into the driveway without warning. Claire was her mother's younger sister, sharp-eyed and persistent in a way that made Eliza's stomach clench with fear. She invited herself inside, settled into the living room sofa, and looked around with an expression that suggested she was cataloging every detail. The sofa sat just 3 feet from the rug that covered the loose floorboards. Claire's coffee cup rested on the side table directly above where Eliza's mother lay. The irony was not lost on Eliza, who sat rigid in the armchair across from her aunt, hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles went white. Claire asked the questions Eliza had been dreading. Not the polite, easy-to-deflect questions from distant relatives, but specific, pointed questions that suggested she had been thinking about this for a long time. Why hadn't anyone actually spoken to her mother in years? Why were all communications filtered through Eliza? Why had her mother not attended her own father's funeral 2 years ago? Eliza felt the walls closing in with each question, her carefully constructed lies showing cracks. She stammered through responses that sounded weak, even to her own ears. Claire watched her with those sharp eyes, saying nothing, but Eliza could feel the suspicion radiating from her like heat. After Claire left, Eliza stood in the living room for a long time, staring at the rug. The house felt different now, like Claire's suspicion had awakened something. That night, the sounds were louder. Not just creaking, but something that sounded almost like scratching, like fingers dragging across wood from underneath. Eliza lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to the house settle and shift around her. She called Mike at 2 a.m, desperate for his voice, for any connection to reality. He answered, groggy and confused. When she tried to explain what she was hearing, he went quiet for a long moment. Then he said they needed to be more careful, that they needed to prepare for the possibility that someone might discover the truth. The way he said it made Eliza realize he had been thinking about this possibility for a long time. Maybe since the beginning. The nightmares intensified. Eliza dreamed of her mother clawing at the underside of the floorboards, fingernails leaving marks in the wood. She dreamed of the floor splitting open during one of Claire's visits, of her mother's body rising up like an accusation. She woke from these dreams with her heart hammering. The line between sleep and waking blurred until she wasn't sure which was more real. During the day, she found herself staring at the floor, imagining she could see the outline of the boards that had been pried up and replaced. No one else would notice, she told herself. The craftsmanship had been good, the nails driven in carefully, the rug positioned perfectly, but she knew. And knowing was enough to make every footstep feel like a confession. Mike came, over less and less as the 4th year approached. When he did visit, he looked older, worn down by the weight of what they had done. They sat in the kitchen, avoiding the living room, speaking in low voices about nothing important. The easy comfort they once shared had died somewhere along the way, suffocated by guilt and fear. Eliza wondered sometimes if they had ever really loved each other, or if that too had been buried under the floorboards, another casualty of that terrible night. Claire called on a Wednesday in March. She had been making calls, she said, her voice tight, with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. She had contacted the company where Eliza's mother supposedly worked. They had no record of anyone by that name. She had reached out to expat groups in Southeast Asia. No one had heard of her. She had hired a private investigator who found no passport activity, no financial records, nothing to suggest Eliza's mother had left the country at all. The silence on the phone line after Claire finished speaking felt like falling. Eliza's mouth went dry, her mind racing through possibilities, excuses, explanations. But there were none that would hold up under scrutiny. Claire's voice, when she spoke again, was cold and certain. She was coming back to the house, she said. And this time she wasn't leaving until she got real answers. Eliza hung up the phone and stood in her kitchen, the walls seeming to press in from all sides. She called Mike, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. He answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting for this call. When she told him about Claire, about the investigation, about the impending visit, he went completely silent. Then, he said something that made Eliza's blood run cold. He said they needed to move the body. They needed to do it tonight, before Claire came back, before the police got involved, before everything fell apart. But moving the body felt impossible. 4 years had passed. The decomposition would be advanced. The smell would be overwhelming. And where would they even take it? How could they dig up the living room floor, extract what remained, transport it somewhere else, all without anyone noticing? The logistics of murder had seemed simple in the heat of that terrible moment 4 years ago, but the logistics of covering it up now felt insurmountable. Mike insisted, though, his voice cracking with panic on the phone. If they didn't do something, they would be caught. If they were caught, their lives were over. That night, Eliza sat alone in the living room, staring at the rug. The house was completely silent around her. No creaking, no whispers, nothing. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. She thought about pulling up the floorboards, about facing what lay beneath, but she couldn't make herself move. Fear had rooted her to the chair, every muscle in her body locked tight. She sat there until dawn broke, cold morning light filtering through the windows, illuminating the room where her mother's body had rested for 4 years. When Mike arrived that morning, his face haggard and desperate, Eliza told him no. They couldn't move the body. They couldn't run. All they could do was wait for the truth to surface the way buried things eventually always do. Claire returned the next day with a man in a suit who introduced himself as Detective Morrison. They stood in the entryway, and Eliza knew from the way they looked at her that this was the end. The detective asked if he could look around the house. Eliza's voice sounded distant and strange when she said yes. She watched as they moved through the rooms, their footsteps echoing on the old wooden floors. When they reached the living room, Claire stopped. She looked at the rug with an expression Eliza couldn't read. Then she asked Eliza to move it. The request hung in the air like smoke. Eliza felt her legs moving, without conscious thought. Bending down, pulling back the heavy rug to reveal the floorboards beneath, the detective knelt, examining the wood with a practiced eye. He pointed to the nails, newer than the others, driven in at slightly different angles. He pressed his hand against the boards and felt them give slightly, loose in their fittings. What happened next felt like watching a movie of someone else's life. Police arrived. Crime scene tape went up. The floorboards came up. And what had been buried for 4 years was finally brought into the light. Eliza sat in the back of a police car, hands cuffed behind her back, watching as they carried her mother out of the house in a body bag. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, whispering behind their hands. Mike was brought out in cuffs too, his head down, refusing to look at anyone. The house stood empty behind them, windows dark, as if it was finally able to rest after 4 years of holding its terrible secret. The trial came and went. In a blur of testimony and evidence and faces Eliza didn't recognize, she was sentenced to 25 years. Mike got 20. The house on Rosewood Lane was sold at auction to a family from out of state who didn't know its history. Eliza spent her first year in prison thinking about the floorboards, about the weight of secrets, about how the house had known all along what lay beneath. She dreamed about it sometimes, that living room, the rug, the creaking sounds in the night. In her dreams, her mother was still down there, still waiting, still patient in the dark. Years passed. Eliza became a number, a routine, a face behind bars that blended with all the other faces. She stopped counting the days, stopped imagining a future beyond the walls. Mike wrote to her once, a letter that arrived 3 years into his sentence. He said he was sorry. He said he wished they had never done it, never tried to cover it up, never convinced themselves they could live with what they had done. Eliza never wrote back. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in silence, in those 4 years of footsteps over a grave, in the nights spent listening to a house that wouldn't let them forget. 15 years into her sentence, Eliza learned that the house on Rosewood Lane had been torn down. The new owners had complained about sounds, about cold spots, about feelings of unease that never went away. They sold it after 2 years, and the next owner sold it after 1. Eventually, someone bought the property just to demolish the house and build something new. Eliza felt something break inside her when she heard the news, though she couldn't say what. The house had been the last physical evidence of what happened, the last witness to that night. Now, it was gone, reduced to rubble and memory. On her 40th birthday, Eliza sat in the prison yard and thought about her mother. Not the body in the ground, but her mother, as she had been when Eliza was young. She tried to remember. Her laugh, the way she smelled like lavender and coffee, the stories she told at bedtime. But those memories felt distant and unreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. All Eliza could remember clearly was the weight of the secret, the sound of the floorboards, and the years spent pretending everything was fine, while her world rotted from within. Mike died 5 years before his release date. Heart attack, sudden and unexpected. Eliza learned about it from a chaplain who thought she should know. She felt nothing when she heard. The man she had loved, or thought she loved, had become as distant and buried as everything else from that time. His death was just another ending to a story that had too many endings and no real conclusion. When Eliza was finally released at 46 years old, she stood outside the prison gates with nothing but a small bag of belongings and nowhere to go. The world had moved on without her. Technology advancing, people aging, everything familiar, made strange. She took a bus to a halfway house in a city she'd never been to before, where no one knew her name or her story. She got a job cleaning office buildings at night, work that required no questions and no connections. She lived alone in a studio apartment with bare walls and no decorations. She owned almost nothing because possessions felt like anchors to a life she didn't want to remember. But some nights, lying in bed in the dark, Eliza could still hear it. That sound of wood creaking, of something shifting beneath floorboards. She knew it was impossible. The house was gone, torn down years ago. Her mother's remains had been properly buried in a cemetery plot after the trial. There was nothing left to haunt her but memory. But the sound persisted, a phantom echo of guilt and secrets, and 4 years spent walking over a grave. She wondered sometimes if she would hear it for the rest of her life, that creaking sound that marked every footstep with an accusation. She wondered if the house had really been torn down, or if it lived on somewhere inside her, still cold, still waiting, still remembering what lay beneath its floors. And in the darkest hours before dawn, when the world was quiet and she was most alone, Eliza had to accept the truth. Some secrets never stay buried, no matter how deep you dig. Some houses never stop haunting you, even after they're gone. And some footsteps echo forever, walking over graves that exist only in memory, in guilt, in the hollow space where peace used to be. If this story left you unsettled, hit that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even darker. Thanks for listening, and remember, some secrets have weight that never fades.